The film opens in October 1862 during the peak of the American Civil War. Confederate soldiers brace themselves as they march towards Union forces, undeterred by cannon fire and bullets, leading to a brutal clash. Newton Knight, a Confederate medic, transports an injured soldier to safety and tends to the wounded, gaining a first-hand understanding of the war's horrors, which leaves him disillusioned with the battlefield. Newton later learns that slave owners with 20 or more slaves are exempt from fighting and allowed to return home. This realization only deepens his frustration with the war. Late one night, while taking a break, a teenage boy named Daniel from his hometown approaches Newton in tears. Daniel tells him that his family's belongings have been seized and that he has been drafted against his will. Daniel pleads with Newton to join him in the next day's advance, hoping to survive. Newton agrees without hesitation. The following day, Newton and Daniel are in combat together. Newton instructs Daniel to follow his orders and ignore any NCOs or officers. They advance ahead of the main charge and take cover in a trench. When a squadron arrives and a sergeant orders them to move, Newton hesitates. Daniel is then shot and Newton drags him away from the fight. Newton tries to reassure the dying Daniel and attempts to get him to a makeshift hospital, but due to the high number of casualties, Daniel is eventually left unattended and dies. Newton decides to return Daniel's body to his mother in Jones County for a proper burial. He deserts the Confederate Army and makes his way back home with Daniel's remains on a mule. Upon returning, Newton explains to his wife, Serena, his disillusionment with the war and his reasons for deserting. He then discovers that another family's property has been seized by Confederate forces as a form of tax to support the war effort. Days later, when Newton and Serena's infant son falls ill, Newton seeks medical help at a nearby roadhouse. Aunt Sally directs him to a slave named Rachel, renowned for her healing abilities. Rachel comes to the Knight residence and tends to the child. The scene shifts to 1947, where Newton's great-grandson Davis faces charges. Davis, being Newton's descendant and 1/8 black, is accused of marrying a white woman, which was illegal at the time. In the past, Newton visits a farm family whose livestock is about to be confiscated, threatening their survival through the winter. He arms the mother and her 3 daughters with rifles and teaches them how to use them. When Lieutenant Barber and his cavalry officers arrive searching for deserters, Newton, the mother, and the daughters confront them with their rifles. Newton also cleverly uses sticks to create the illusion of more people hiding in the barn. The bluff succeeds and the soldiers leave, though they promise to return. When they later approach Newton's home and release their hounds, Newton is chased and bitten by one of the dogs. In his attempt to jump over a fence, he kills the dog with his knife. With no other options, he turns to Aunt Sally for help. Aunt Sally lends him her slave, George, who guides Newton through the swamp. George advises Newton to wait, and hours later, Rachel arrives and leads him to a group of runaway slaves led by a man named Moses Washington, who is wearing a metal slave collar. Moses tends to Newton's leg wound. Wanted posters of Newton are spread everywhere. As Newton becomes a fugitive, Serena decides to leave their home with their only child. This strengthens Davis's case, as it was known that Serena had left and thus could not have had another child with Newton. Among the other runaways, Newton and Moses form a bond. Staying with the group, Newton gradually grows to care for everyone, a behavior that was unusual at the time. He helps Moses remove the metal slave collar from his neck. Soon, George delivers some guns, and they arm themselves against the slave catchers who pass by their swamp refuge. Rachel visits Newton from time to time, where he teaches her to read and shoot. In July 1863, after the fall of Vicksburg to Union forces, more Confederate soldiers desert. Among them are some of Newton's former comrades, and many discover the swamp and join Newton's group of fugitives. While Lieutenant Barber is returning from a supply run, Newton and a few others ambush them from the cover of the woods. The lieutenant reports the incident to Captain Hood, who dismisses them as mere deserters, referring to them as the freemen of Jones County and showing no interest in dealing with them. Back at the swamp, Newton and his group establish a militia and build a small community, complete with grain harvesting and shelter construction. As tensions rise, Newton takes advantage of the situation to recruit more supporters. The Confederates continue their aggressive search for supplies and discover a hidden stash of corn. When they try to seize it, Newton's men, numbering over 100, surround and confront them in the woods to reclaim the corn. The freemen of Jones County celebrate their victory, cooking a hog openly and displaying their triumph. Confident in their strong numbers and the swamp's natural defenses, they feel secure against any confrontation. Captain Hood then approaches Aunt Sally at her shop, urging Newton to disband his group with the promise of full pardon if they return to the front lines. If not, Hood threatens public hangings. When this approach fails, the soldiers set fire to barns and continue to offer pardons to militia members who surrender. In response, Newton rallies his troops to resist. Ward, who is hiding with Newton in the swamps, grows disillusioned and manages to persuade another deserter and 2 boys to surrender. Lieutenant Barber arranges the surrender, but when Captain Hood sees only a few of them, he orders their execution. At their funeral, Newton stirs the crowd's emotions, urging them to fight back. The militia strikes back by using coffins, with Moses and a few others emerging from them and opening fire on the soldiers. Many soldiers are hit in the ensuing shootout. One soldier, wounded, flees into a small chapel. Newton follows, corners the captain under a bench, and though he fires at Hood, he only pretends to aim for him. Instead, Newton kills Hood by strangling him and drags his body outside. A year later, the militia, now larger and stronger, takes the fight to the Confederates and eventually defeats their army. The Confederate flag is taken down and the American flag is raised, bringing jubilant celebrations to the people. Newton leads Rachel to a private room with her own bed, and she is overwhelmed with emotion and begins to cry. In retaliation, Colonel Lowry and his troops march towards Ellisville to prepare a regiment against the militia. Newton gathers everyone and delivers a speech, reading from a document that outlines the terms of their future free state of Jones. The militia holds out until the end of the war and thrives. The freemen develop their land, and Moses is eventually reunited with his wife and child. However, the government later revokes the promise of 40 acres and a mule for each freedman. Despite this setback, the town grows and a school is established where Rachel teaches reading. Serena returns to Jones County with her son, sharing how her life has changed since she left, including the destruction of her barns by fire. Although Newton now lives with Rachel, they welcome Serena and invite her to stay in the neighborhood. When Moses' son is kidnapped by slave owners, Moses sets out to rescue him, with Newton closely monitoring to ensure his safety. Despite the war's end, slaves continue to be forced to work in the fields a year after their supposed freedom. Moses, accompanied by his son, is ambushed by two armed slavers. Newton intervenes and as a result is later tried in court. He denies the accusations against him and pays $70 to the slave owner to secure Moses' son's release. Months later, Rachel gives birth and Serena is seen helping care for the infant. Years later, during a court case where Davis is trying to determine whether he is descended from Rachel or Serena, Newton's family Bible is introduced as evidence, confirming Rachel's childbirth and providing strong support for the prosecutors. Moses, now working to gather support from freedmen and slaves and encouraging them to vote for their future, is followed by an angry mob of white men. When Newton hears of this, he searches for Moses and eventually finds his body hanging from a tree. Moses has been lynched and humiliated, causing deep mourning in the community. On Election Day, all eyes are on Newton and his group as they head to the polls. Newton requests Republican tickets, and although the racist white men hesitate, they eventually provide them. Despite the group's steadfastness, the Democratic vote overwhelmingly defeats the Republican one. As Union troops are withdrawn, Klan activity surges, and over the next few years, thousands of African Americans are killed in the lead-up to the 1876 election. Rachel, worried about her safety and her child due to their situation, faces uncertainty. In the modern court, Davis is granted bail, but with conditions. His marriage must be annulled and he must leave Mississippi. He refuses, arguing that his case is unjust, leading the judge to sentence him to 5 years in prison. To avoid federal issues, the Mississippi State Court later overturns his conviction. The film concludes with Newton and Rachel unable to legally marry due to racist laws. Instead, Newton deeds 160 acres of land to Rachel, making her one of the few African American women in the country to own land. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this.